Thank you so much. Thanks, Annalise. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. This is a really, my name's Lisa Dolovich. For those of you who I don't know, there might be a few people on that I don't know. I'm a professor and dean at the Leslie Jan Faculty of Pharmacy, and really happy to join this group this morning, which is something a bit new that we're trying, which is to host a Policymaker-Researcher Dialogue. And this is being hosted on behalf of the Network for Improving Health Systems, which is a collaboration between the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy and the Dawana School of Public Health. And before I get too much farther into what that is and why we're here, I will take a step back and just acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. And that's especially, I think, important today, tomorrow, as we really consider truth and reconciliation and how we all relate to the land and the peoples, First Nations peoples, for whom we interact with on a daily basis. But this land where I'm sitting, which is really representing the University of Toronto, has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and to really consider even today, as we look at medication management, pharmacy practice, health system changes, I think especially what also that means for Indigenous peoples and how pharmacy and the healthcare system can really be maximized to the benefits of those peoples, for sure. The idea today is to have an opportunity, really almost an informal opportunity, to hear from policymakers together with researchers to consider what are some of the needs of the health system. The Network for Improving Health Systems is a collaboration of, as I've said, of our faculties at the University of Toronto. And the idea is that the network creates an engine for evidence and knowledge translation that relates to how we collectively can improve the healthcare system. And that really does have a focus on evolving pharmacy practice, but also really wider health policy as it relates to medication management and the health system. So we do hope that this kind of event will help bring researchers and policymakers together to have some discussion. We have brought a panel together that really represents different perspectives and different organizations where health policy is created, again, in different ways, either focused on practice, focused on regulation, focused on medication management. And we hope that by having researchers in this virtual room and policymakers in this virtual room, we can just have discussions about what's needed. And I guess I can see around the virtual room some amazing researchers. And we do have a call for proposal coming up, with the deadline being December 12th, where the Network for Improving Health Systems is encouraging submissions to this call for proposals. And we hope that the research that really is generated through that call can address really pressing policymaker needs. And again, part of the idea is to help researchers get to know each other, but also to help researchers and policymakers make connections and hear from one another as to what research could be important and how we can work together. I'm just going to see if Audrey has joined us on my screen. I don't see her, but I will just bring greetings from Dawana School of Public Health as well, because this really is a venture that we are building collaborations across public health and pharmacy to address what we think are important issues. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zubin, who's going to moderate our session, and take it away, Zubin.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today. My name is Zubin Austin. I am the Academic Director for the Center for Practice Excellence, a professor at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, and also a recipient of funding from the previous round of this program. And so I'm very excited today to introduce our panelists. who will be joining us to share their perspectives as policymakers in different areas on what research is effective, how research actually influences decision-making, and what we as a research community can do to build better relationships to enhance the impact of the research that we do. Joining us today, we have Angeline Ng. Angeline is a graduate of the University of Toronto's Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. She's a registered pharmacist and currently the Vice President of Professional Affairs at the Ontario Pharmacists Association. Throughout her career, she has worked in a variety of different pharmacy settings, including community pharmacy, long-term care, the pharmaceutical industry, as well as teaching. In her current position at the OPA, she is focused on advancing the profession through advocacy with the goal to shape sustainable and positive futures for pharmacy professionals, patients, and our broader health system. Also joining us today is Ned Pojcik. Ned is Green Shield's Vice President of Pharmacy Benefits Management, and in this role, he is responsible for overseeing both the strategic and operational elements of the Green Shield administration pharmacy benefits management function. And that includes leading Green Shield's strategic direction with respect to pharmacy and drug benefits management, as well as oversight of drug pricing, formulary management, specialty pharmacy, patient support programs, and prior authorizations. Ned has an industry background that includes a role as Director of Health Policy for the Ontario Pharmacists Association, and also holds master's and PhD degrees from the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences here at the University of Toronto, where he is currently appointed as an adjunct lecturer. Finally, also joining us today is Shenda Tanchek. Shenda is the Registrar and CEO of the Ontario College of Pharmacists. Her regulatory career spans more than 25 years, having served in leadership and consulting capacities with regulators across the country. Before joining OCP, Shenda was a regulatory consultant who helped organizations reach agreements about policy and programs, strategic plans, collaborative partnerships, and internal governance. Prior to her consulting career, Shenda also served as CEO and Registrar of the College of Physiotherapists of Ontario and Senior Advisor to the Executive Office at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. She is 3 times past president of the Federation of Health Regulatory College of Ontario, now called Health Professional Regulators of Ontario, and chaired the Canadian Alliance of Physiotherapy Regulators Registrar Committee for 2 terms. Shenda has a diverse academic background, including a Bachelor of Law from the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Education from the University of Alberta, both of which build on her earlier education in advertising and public relations, and she is currently a non-practicing member of the Law Society of Ontario. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining us today. Before we get started with formal questions, just a few housekeeping items to remind us all about. You will already have seen flash across your screen a reminder that today's event is being audio and video recorded. We do ask that you keep yourself muted during the event today. However, as we get to some of the more interactive elements of today's programs, we would invite you to turn both your camera and your microphone on. Given the size of the group, it would be great if we could interact with each other in more informal manners and have some opportunities for question and answer. And so with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists and ask just a few somewhat scripted questions to get us started. And the first one is, for those of us who are not necessarily entirely familiar with what acronyms like OPA and OCP and Green Shield really mean, I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about your organization. What is its main mandate and mission, and how does your organization typically interact with the health research community? Let's start with Angeline.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephen. So the OPA, or the Ontario Pharmacists Association, is a voluntary member association. We have about 9,000 members who are pharmacy professionals in Ontario. Contrary to what the name might suggest, it does include pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, as well as our students. The mission of the organization is to advance the profession as a vital healthcare provider. And we do this through advocacy, through innovation, and through support services. And so some examples of the work that we do include things like advocating for advancing scope, advocating for funding for services. We develop tools and resources to help pharmacists deliver services more efficiently or effectively, to help improve patient care and really commit to excellence in patients' care. We also deliver continuing professional development to pharmacy professionals so that we can support that sort of lifelong learning journey throughout their career.
Great, thank you. Ned, most of us will have heard of Green Shields. Perhaps some of us walk around with a little bit of you in our wallets. Tell us a little bit about what your mandate is as an organization and how you typically interact with the health research community.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Zubin. So, yeah, I suspect many of you are plan members. I hope you're happy with us, first of all. That's an important thing to start with. So yes, I'm my organization, Green Shield, is a national not-for-profit insurance benefits provider. We serve about 4.5 million Canadians with various types of benefit plans, and we're responsible for sort of overseeing a $2.2 billion drug budget, in terms of what we pay out annually in terms of drug costs, or about triple that in terms of if you look at overall benefits across the country. As part of that mandate, our goal is really to help serve our employer clients who ultimately provide these benefit plans and are responsible for paying a majority of these drug costs. From the perspective of my role, so I oversee basically the drug benefits management function and ensuring that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of effectively managing drug costs while providing effective, care for patients. In terms of how we interface with the research community, it is something that is definitely an evolution. It's something that I would certainly like to bring more to the fore to the organization, because I do think that as it pertains to private insurers and benefit plans across the country, that interaction or even awareness of what the research community produces and the high quality evidence that exists out there is very, very limited. And I know we'll get into more of that conversation as we go forward today. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Ned. Finally, Shenda, tell us a little bit about OCP, its mandate and mission, and the different ways in which you have and continue to interact with health researchers.
Thanks, Zubin. Hi, everybody. It's likely that you know, but I just sort of like to say it to remind myself what we do at the college. So we are the regulator, the licensing body for pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, and pharmacies as well in Ontario. And part of our mandate, which is entirely legislatively established, and I think that's very important. We are wholly funded by registrant fees. We take very seriously the constraints on our mandate. So we understand ourselves not to be free to go off and develop wonderful and important things that aren't stipulated in the legislation. And what the legislation says our job is entry to practice, setting entry to practice standards and licensing these people and bodies, ensuring competence throughout the time that they deliver the services, investigating and dealing with complaints or concerns about performance or competence. And I said ensuring competency, and what I didn't say about that was by taking a look, by supporting them to perform at an acceptable level. And finally, to develop policies and standards so that we can establish what that level is, so the rules of the game are clear. Our relationship with the research community is avid readers of the products, avid listeners and learners, and through strategic partnerships wherever we can.
Thank you. Now, all three of you, in fact, all of us, occupy incredibly busy, chaotic worlds where there are multiple demands on our time and our interest. Many of us who are researchers have perhaps the luxury of focusing on a specific topic that we believe is incredibly important. And some of us as researchers struggle to get our priority topics on your agendas as policymakers. And so I think it'd be helpful for all of us to understand a little bit about, in these busy, chaotic times, you have to deal with everything ranging from climate change, to the rise of artificial intelligence, to economic realities, cost containment, etc. So many things on your plate. How do your organizations establish priorities? And having established priorities, how do your organizations actually think about or measure success and value and impact in those priority areas? Let me start with you, Ned.
Okay, so I guess maybe at the highest level, this will vary greatly by organization, of course, but with Green Shield and specifically having been established by a federal act of parliament and an organization that is very structured, not for profit, our exclusive focus is always in terms of how much impact are we having on the community. So what I mean by that is, as an organization, we're structured such that all of our surpluses, when they're generated through our business activities, are turned back over to the community in the form of community support grants, funding of initiatives, whatever they may be. So for example, we partner with the University of Toronto in many various ways, Faculty of Dentistry, for example, Faculty of Pharmacy in other ways. We partner with national organizations on deploying the capital that we generate to those kinds of community activities. That's kind of our main focus. This is the reason why we exist. Then to kind of shift and understand how do we generate the money that we need to generate in order to fund those activities, it really starts with sort of an annual operating plan we develop as an organization, where we say for the next year, we will focus on these three things. Here's where our focus is going to be. We need to do X, Y, Z. And it comes from really, to some degree, just ground up, seeing the things that are happening in the industry, right? So if we expect that drug costs are going to balloon next year because we're expecting 50 new biologic drugs to come to market, that's something we need to be ready for. And our clients are expecting us to have strategies ready to deal with that. If we know biosimilars are coming next year, how exactly are we going to, from a policy perspective, approach those biosimilars? What's the best strategy? What's the best approach to that? So there is some of that ground up activity that occurs just by sheer organically through just development of pharmaceuticals, and that each pharmaceutical presents a new strategy challenge that we need to think through. And then there's sort of an element that involves us just trying to be one step ahead and think about what the future of benefits looks like. So for example, I'll use this as a reference point. The COVID, the pandemic, has changed the role of benefit plans, for example. Historically, we were check cutters, right? You tell us you paid for a claim and we cut you a check to return that money back to you. But the expectation of the role of private benefit providers and insurance companies now growing tremendously. Employers are demanding more holistic services in integrated fashion, almost like a mini healthcare system that is going to be provided to the employees that exists in parallel to other healthcare systems. So if you look at, for example, from our perspective, we've got a new digital health ecosystem that exists where you enter and you get access to pharmacy services, you get access to mental health services, telemedicine, all in integrated fashion, all talking to one another in real time. That's kind of the mini healthcare system concept that I described that is now an expectation of Canadian employers. So every systemic thing happening on the ground is something we need to respond to. And we look at that, we try to understand that, we try to see what is our response to that, and how do we meet our employers' customers' needs to give them what they need and be one step ahead of that journey. So pause there.
Very interesting. I think certainly as people who may think about Green Shield, as you say, as simply as a check cutter, this evolution and the priorities that underlie that evolution are very important for us as researchers to be able to plug into where you are going and sort of meet some of those or anticipate some of those needs. Shenda, you work in an incredibly tranquil and stable and never-changing environment, I'm sure, at the College of Pharmacists. Tell us a little bit about how, as a creature of government, as somebody who has to interact with government and deal with some of those issues, manage professions, manage patients, there's so many different stakeholders in your orbit. How do you identify your priorities as an organization?
Thanks, Zubin. So in some ways, it's a simple answer. So our board identifies the priorities based on information. I don't want to call it evidence because there's some of it is evidence, but information that is brought to them about where the greatest need for patient protection is, and the college is likely to be able to have an impact. So that's one way that priorities are established. Or we get a phone call from the Ministry of Health. That's another way. Sometimes we suddenly get from a third party. I'm thinking about time delayed safes. So the news and the police suddenly tell us about this problem that was bubbling along and suddenly seems to explode about pharmacy robberies, and that's a brand new way that our priorities get interrupted and we have to shift everything. I think that we have not always done a great job. We've dashed from thing to thing and haven't been terrifically strategic about figuring out where we are most likely to have impact. So we're trying to get a little bit better about connecting potential impact with how we're going to spend our energies.
And certainly it's a very complicated environment. And we see sort of in comparison to Green Shield, where there has been perhaps the luxury of strategic planning, strategic thinking, strategic direction. The reactive nature of professional regulation today is a reality, and like it does give limited scope for sometimes for that more strategic type of approach. And as researchers, that's pivotal for us to understand. What about you, Angie? In your world, tell us a little bit about how you establish priorities and how from those priorities you start to define success in your work.
Yeah, thanks, Zubin. It was really interesting to me to listen to Ned and Shenda go first, actually, because I feel like we sort of have elements of both of those. So we are also a not-for-profit organization, and sort of Ned described some of that ground-up component. Most of our revenue comes from our membership fees as well, and being a voluntary not-for-profit organization, you can imagine that our revenue lines are can vary from year to year. But that sort of ground up component that Ned talked about is so important for us, because as a voluntary member organization that relies on those member fees, it's really important for us to consider what's important to our members, what are the up and coming concerns and barriers and opportunities for our members. And then listening to Shenda talk, there's a lot of that reactivity that happens with our strategic planning as well. And, is that helpful for a long-term strategic plan? It throws a lot of loops and curveballs into there as well. But we do also have the opportunity to do a long-term strategic plan, because the vision and mandate of our organization is such that we really want to advance the profession. We're looking at sort of a long-term strategy for what does that profession look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So I think the process is similar to some of what Ned and Shenda have talked about. Our board also establishes our strategic plan. Usually these are for multi-years. So I think we released our last 3-year strategic plan in 2023. Within that strategic plan, there's usually specific areas of focus that they've identified. Some of that will have to do with maintaining our organization. So, how do we achieve organic and inorganic growth within the organization? And then some of that has to do with, how do we best serve our members? And then some of that is how do we envision the future of the profession and bring our members there and the entire profession there as sort of the voice of the profession. And then, I don't know if that covers it, but maybe I'll pause there.
Good, thank you. So many of us on the on this particular event have the luxury of working in our areas of special interest, doing the kind of high quality research that we know is should be impactful. And sometimes we find it perhaps a little bit frustrating or peculiar when it seems so obvious based on the research that we're doing and the research that we're seeing. Why is this not being translated into action? by people who actually can make decisions and get stuff done. And so I guess two questions for each of you. The first one is, what actually is the role of research in your decision-making processes? And secondly, could you help us to understand, are there certain kinds of research that is simply more valuable to decision makers like you than other kinds of research? And help us to understand what it is that makes research actually valuable and actionable from your perspectives. Let's start with Shenda.
So I'm going to get going, and then I'm going to ask Katya to fill in any gaps. I think that I've been at the college now for about a year and a half, and I arrived in an organization that very much valued research and data in a variety of sectors. So many of you will have interacted with many of our great staff, and sometimes it's in the policy area, and sometimes it's in the quality area or practice consultants. And then there's our reporting obligations to various agents of the ministry. But what wasn't happening was a terrific amount of coordination. So the role of research was fragmented, I would say. Our ability to leverage the information that we have, or that we get from our partnerships, or that we provide to partners, was limited. Even our understanding of the nature of the evidence we were trying to collect and who would provide it best. As a result, I think some of the information, some of the partnerships we're involved in today have tangential benefits. And Zubin, you sort of alluded to some frustration, and I can well imagine that might be a byproduct of this sort of fractured approach that we've taken. And I could give a treatise on how it happened that it is this fractured. But Katya, whose name I keep saying, is our senior consultant of evidence and research, and she's been with us 6-8 months, something like that, Katya. And her role is to try and bring a more coherent focus. So the bottom line is, we care about information that is going to demonstrate that we have reduced risk to patients. And first of all, we need to, and Katya's preliminary work has been very much focused on identifying the activities that pharmacies and pharmacists and technicians are involved in that create risk or fail to prevent risk.
Yeah, so if I can just interrupt for a second, that I think for many of us on the call, that's a really important insight, that from a regulatory lens, risk reduction sounds like it's being prioritized over benefit enhancement. That in a world where you can only choose one, that regulatory lens of things that reduce risk rather than bring new benefit, that's where some of your priority and thinking is really going to focus.
Yes, and I think that's a shift. The board is definitely behind it. It's a concept that's paid a lot of lip service to in the regulatory world, but I think we're hoping that we will be leaders in actually validating a risk-based regulatory approach.
I think for many of us, that's a very important insight in terms of framing research, presenting research, and actually even driving research questions. Katya, the much referred to Katya, do you have anything to add from your perspective, from that regulatory lens, about what kinds of research are more or less valued by an organization?
So as Shenda mentioned, there's a real focus right now to understanding risk. In the regulatory world, risk has frequently been enterprise risk. We look at the way that we function as regulators. We look at our capacity, our responsiveness, how much we are and how well we are fulfilling our accountability role to the public. That's really been the focus up to now, I think, on the types of risk that regulators have been involved in. So Shenda's correct that this is a shift to an area of risk that has not been the focus for a lot of regulators until recently. And so really focusing on practice-based risk, I think, is important. What I would add, Zubin, is that risk reduction and benefit enhancement do not necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. But as a first step, we really do want everybody at the college and the board and the work that we're focusing on, the data that we have, the analyses that we're looking for, to establish a framework where we know what our harm possibility hotspots might be. We don't know that now. We have some idea. We have really good data in our AIMS dispensing error database that can begin to give us hints of what it is that are the precursor events of a dispensing error or a near miss. We have a much sort of blunt instrument looking at what gets complained about. And we have data in terms of where pharmacists aren't doing so well on their practice assessment that, again, create the precursor conditions for a bad outcome down the line. But all of that needs to come together first so as to have really targeted looks at what can actually lead to harm. Some of that might be at the individual pharmacist level or pharmacy practitioner level. Some of it might be more systemic. And then I think once that framework is established, then we begin thinking about what the appropriate regulatory response is. And the regulatory response might be focusing on risk reduction in particular people, and it could be benefit enhancement in others, but that's a subsequent step.
And I think that's very, very important for us, because even if one comes to research with a mindset of benefit enhancement, in presenting it and explaining it, it's also at saying one of the benefits is risk reduction. And that's that kind of connecting those dots is incredibly important for a regulatory audience. Thank you to both of you. Let me turn it over to Angeline. What's your thought on the way your organization uses research and the kinds of research that OPA finds particularly valuable or helpful in its decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Zubin. It was really interesting to listen to just this exchange about sort of bringing less risk versus sort of benefit enhancement, because as an advocating body, we tend to focus, I think, on that benefit enhancement part. We have a government who is very interested and willing to leverage pharmacies. We've seen that over the last few years with this expansion of scope and what we sort of have referred to as like a translation of advocacy success. That said, at the start, we talked a little bit about our membership. It's comprised of pharmacists from a very diverse background of practice settings. And when I listened to the discussion about, the importance of bringing less risk, and I think about the value that has to our members, there is certainly a lot of need for research around balancing risk versus benefit. It's a question that we often get asked in our advocacy efforts. So having evidence that speaks to the benefit, right? So for example, of like minor ailment services is really great to help support success in expansion of services. But as part of those discussions, there often is the question, what is the risk? Are there any safety concerns? Something like administration of publicly funded vaccines. You would think that because pharmacies currently already administer flu shots, COVID shots, it would be a pretty natural extension to extend that to other publicly funded vaccines. But one of the questions that came up was there any safety data around pharmacists administering these vaccines? And so having that balanced approach to evidence that supports advocacy, a very well-rounded piece of advocacy, I think, is important. That research plays a huge role in the work that we do. Just to give an example, the minor ailments funding proposal that we submitted had 25 references. The majority of those came from published literature And we were very successfully able to advocate for public funding for all the minor ailments that are currently offered in Ontario, which is, I think we're well ahead of some other provinces that don't have that funding mechanism in place. And a big part of that success relied heavily on evidence that showed value to these services, both from a benefit and an economics perspective. So yeah, I think historically there's sort of been this perception that we don't like research from OPA as an advocacy body unless it shows positive benefit. Because that is what's going to contribute to advocacy success. But I think that there's a bit of misconception to that, because we do represent a very diverse group of members, and having research that reflects that diversity and that the different perspectives and the different ways to consider benefit and risk is important, because it helps us serve our members better.
Very interesting. And again, coming back to that, thinking in terms of our own research around the risk benefit calculus is going to be a very important framing mechanism, but also mechanism for the way we identify questions, gather our data, and interpret our findings. Ned, how does Green Shield and how do you as a decision maker value different kinds of research? And what is it that you're really looking for in terms of actionable work?
Yeah, good question. When it comes to the role of evidence in the private sector and in private benefit plans, it's just one element of that private sector. I think I continue to be sort of really discouraged as to the lack of reliance on evidence to make decisions. So let me give one example, which I lived through for a number of years, which I thought was very powerful, right? So about 5-6 years ago, when I referenced this before, when biologic drugs were first coming off patent and we had the first wave of biosimilars come to Canada, at that time, there was ample evidence from jurisdictions around the world, Europe, multiple, dozens and dozens of really high quality randomized clinical controlled trials that showed the equal efficacy and safety of these biosimilar drugs to the originator biologics. Despite that, the discussion and the rhetoric around these drugs all focused on risk, right? Patient organizations, which heavily funded by pharmaceutical manufacturers to a large degree, came out and said, we can never embrace these things, should never force patients to use these things. We need choice, 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 choice. The evidence was abundantly clear. You couldn't ask for more evidence or something like that. You just simply couldn't. And yet no one relied on. Everybody relied on potential risks, potential concerns, potential this, and that. So I'd often have this dialogue and say, somebody will come up on a stage in a conference and say, well, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. And I'd say, no, it hasn't. Let me show you these 18 clinical trials that showed none of that happened, but it could, right? So that power of that human anecdote, whatever you want to call it, trumped evidence time and time again, right? The only time that this started to gain momentum and is now very much established in 2023 in private benefit plans, this idea of biosimilars are equally safe and effective, came when the public drug plans across the country started moving aggressively, starting with BC, et cetera, on using biosimilars as their preferred option, and then going to the route of switching patients over to the biosimilars, which Ontario is in the midst right now, about to conclude in December of this year. So, prime example, right, where, again, by any standard, any stretch of the imagination, evidence was there, just no one read it. No one cared to read it because they were driven by this other, powerful anecdote, powerful thoughts, and to be quite frank, interested bodies who wish for the evidence not to be presented and not to be considered because it's kind of inconvenient, right, to the business interests of various parties. That repeats itself time and again. So how do you break through that? It's complicated, but so very important, right?
Shenda, I see that you've got a comment. We'd love to encourage interaction amongst our panelists.
I was just going to jump in because Ned inspired me to say, when Katya and I, when we talk about risk, where there isn't any is exciting to us as well, because what we want to do then is get out of practitioners' way. So we don't want to waste our resource resources pursuing our quality assurance program is a good example, and it is where there is some use now of assessment of risk to determine who ought to be assessed and how frequently, and we're sort of moving farther down that path. We don't want to go into practices where there's no evidence at all that somebody is going to get in trouble or has any potential for risk. We want to leave them alone. We want to spend our time focusing on other people. Similarly, standards of practice about, and the scope expansion is a good example. We don't want to put restrictions on particular minor ailments where the risk is vanishingly small that any harm could be done. If we're going to impose educational or other requirements on pharmacists or pharmacy technicians before they can undertake particular activities, we only want to do that based on evidence that those conditions are a requirement to protect patients. So the absence of risk is also excellent research for us.
Yeah, very, very helpful comment. And like that idea that typically as researchers, we don't think of absence as being researchable or interesting, but absence is certainly something important in your decision making. I guess many of us who are on this call and perhaps who are contemplating applications to this upcoming funding program through the new initiatives program or in a variety of different areas, we're probably all very interested in understanding where you as organizations are in terms of your current areas of interest and priority. All of you work for organizations that are governed by boards of directors, and you take your marching orders from your boards of directors. But as organizations, what are you foreseeing as key policy relevant priorities for which research and evidence may be important for you in the years ahead? Let me start with Angeline.
Sure. I think this is an exciting question for me. I love talking about where we see things going and what our priorities are from sort of the professional side. So I'll kind of park the how do we keep our revenue strong, et cetera, aside, and really just focus on like what is our work for the profession and how do we plan to advance the profession and where do we see the profession. I think some of our priorities continue to be centered around really being able to better leverage pharmacy professionals to support better patient care, better patient access. You've probably seen a lot of that messaging coming from OPA over the past couple of years, especially throughout the pandemic. I think it's really resonated with the public, with government, to be able to successfully advocate. So continuing to build on that. So things like publicly funded vaccines through pharmacies to improve access, continuing to expand the number of minor ailment conditions that we can assess and prescribe for, so that it's kind of in line with the scope of other pharmacists in different provinces of Canada. Beyond just minor ailments, there's a lot of interest in sort of the pharmacist's role in primary care and chronic disease management. So I think those scope pieces will be really important in the next few years to the association. But I think really underpinning all of that is the need to ensure financial sustainability for the sector. And we take that, I think, really seriously here, because it really is a big part of our role in the pharmacy ecosystem. Because without the advocacy body, pushing for funding for these services, it's really hard to move the needle, I think, on those particular pieces. And so in terms of like what would be really helpful, just to sort of give a sense of like what financial sustainability looks like in pharmacy. Our dispensing fees haven't changed since 2014. We all know inflation and the cost of living has gone up, but those dispensing fees and that markup is what supports pharmacies to be able to operate. There's fees for funded services, but even that we're lagging behind in so many provinces. We have the scope to refill, we have the scope to adapt, but that's not paid for. If you wanted to charge the patient and the patient wants to pay, sure, but that's not publicly funded. And so that financial sustainability piece is really important. But I think where we struggle sometimes is finding evidence that speaks to the economic impact pharmacists providing, specific services or just in general. So maybe like the downstream impact of like ED diversion or avoiding serious adverse events, and being able to quantify that economic impact through improved access. Sure, we can compare how much a pharmacist gets paid for minor ailments versus how much a doctor gets paid, but what is the value of that improved access and earlier detection, earlier treatment, earlier intervention? And so I think that that's a space where there isn't as much evidence as would maybe be helpful to support some of those discussions, and really continue to encourage investment in pharmacy as sort of like a sector that provides value to the system and has an ROI to the system.
Yeah. And so that whole issue of, I say, ROI, return on investment, the kinds of research that's going to be impactful for you in the near term, whatever the topic area happens to be, needs to also address the issue of return on investment and financial viability, sustainability. Chenda, how about from OCP's perspective? What are some of the things that are on your radar and some specific needs that you have in terms of priority research right now?
There are a couple, and I first want to sort of, the first one I'm going to talk about is very much related to what Angeline was just talking about. But the other thing I want to say is it can be frustrating as the regulator not to be able to get involved in some of the bigger systems research, which is what Angeline was just talking about. And so our ability to support the association without stepping over onto the advocacy side is also important to us. So we have regular meetings and share information as much as we can and try to be pretty careful about the line in the sand while helping each other. And so I don't know how that informs this discussion, but I feel like it's an important underlying thread to note. Our work, according to our strategic plan, one of the first priorities is ensuring that business practices don't interfere with the ability of pharmacy professionals to deliver high quality care. And that it came up, and our lack of evidence was apparent even in the discussion that happened at the board last week about broadening the scope of practice again with 17 new additional conditions and ailments. And we challenged the board to decide whether to recommend the further expansion of scope before being able to do something to address concerns that we're hearing about the pharmacy work environment. And they decided to go ahead anyway, but we actually don't have any. We have anecdotal evidence. There's a little bit of literature from around the world about specific ways that the work environment, quotas and this kind of thing, the physical environment, have an effect on the ability to deliver care. But that's an area that we'll be very interested in the coming years. Another of our strategic priorities, and I know it aligns very much with the work U of T is doing, is in the EDI sector, and specifically ensuring that we're having an impact on patient care to ensure that patients are not suffering from discrimination, basically. So making the link between our activities and equity at the counter or the bedside. So those are two specific areas. But in the meantime, when we think about assessments and focusing on risk there, developing a better handle on the information that the medication error reporting process could generate, either whether we're asking exactly the right questions or whether we have access to the right information. So it can get pretty granular when it gets down to specific risks. And Katja is just in the process now of developing, I would call them the KPIs that we're going to most care about in terms of patient risk, because we can't follow every ball.
Interesting. Well, thank you. So quite a lot of very practical and specific areas of interest for and a challenge for all of us on this call to align the work that we do in ways that meet the immediate and foreseeable needs of OCP. So Ned, from your perspective, what are some of the foreseeable research needs that are going to guide your decision-making and your action in the years ahead?
So I think, the starting premise by which I think it's important to acknowledge this. So as an organization that is a benefits provider insurance company, we actually own pharmacies. In 2022, Green Shield bought 2 pharmacies, a specialty and a digital pharmacy. So we're also a what we like to call a payer provider, right? So we're very intrigued by this model of integrated care that couples the actual payment for services and the provision of care all under one umbrella.
It goes back to that strategic priority you mentioned of you are a health system now in some ways.
Exactly. And so we're very intrigued by this idea of what is such a system indeed better at delivering health outcomes than a system that is decentralized and involves payers and providers that don't necessarily align on what the goals and objectives are, right? So within that mandate, health outcomes is a stream of work that is underway. And I think it's very early on in terms of what we actually want to find or uncover, what we're looking for. But it's needless to say, one of the key questions is going to be like, are we actually delivering better care as part of this integrated care model than the model that simply, like I said, it involves decentralization of payers and providers? So if I can use an example, in our vision of a digitally integrated healthcare system, you as a patient are seeking care from a mental health practitioner. Of course, this is all with permissions and all the things that the patient must provide. Seek care from a mental health practitioner, seek care from a telemedicine doctor provider. All that information lives in a centralized EMR. Your pharmacist at the digital pharmacy knows what's happening, both with those aspects of care, as long as you give permissions, of course, and that entire ecosystem is talking to one another. Does that end up resulting in better long-term health outcomes, better chronic disease management, et cetera, than what you might otherwise expect in a default model, right? Our hypothesis, and of course, a lot of insurance companies beyond us are now investing in this, in this space. If you look at the announcement just the other day by Sun Life, Canada's largest insurance company, buying Dialogue, which is a telemedicine and other services provider, that bet is a big one that every single insurance company is now about to take. So I do think that there is something about that is transforming how care might be provided that might serve as a model for how the whole system might want to operate at some point, right? And I mean, our entire healthcare system as a whole. Is that integration a blueprint perhaps for others to follow? It's an interesting hypothesis, and the research I think needs to be undertaken to understand whether that indeed is supported by evidence.
So if I can just drill a little bit deeper into this area, you've used the term better outcomes. How does research actually inform your definition of better? Like, what are the specific outcomes? What constitutes better? Is there anything that you're able to share with this audience in terms of what is it that you as an organization is actually chasing in terms of better and outcome?
It's a great point, because we have these conversations very frequently around what's your starting point, right? So is it the default care that you get today at the system as it exists, and then you're transferred into a different model of care, and your indicators on diabetes management and control, your indicators on whatever indicators you use, have they moved the needle from point A to point B? And is that movement even representative of your intervention, or is it just natural life course trajectory of disease? Who knows, right? So you got to answer all these different questions and all of that. None of that is sorted out. None of that has been researched.
Lots of opportunities then for research.
Yes, indeed.
To inform some of that direction of travel.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you. So one final question before we turn it over to the audience for their thoughts and questions. Wink, wink. That's a hint that it's going to be over to you shortly. So start queuing up your questions. I'm going to ask each of our panelists for simply one piece of advice that you would offer to our researchers and students who are listening today. What's one piece of advice you'd like to give them about how they can work more effectively with you as a knowledge user and a policy maker? How can we get started in connecting with you? How can we build relationships? What's just one piece of advice you would offer people on this call? Let's start with you, Ned.
I think connections to the research community are so ever essential. I really appreciate my connection to the Faculty of Pharmacy because I do think it's invaluable, in working with somebody like Mina Tadros. We talk on a monthly basis, and I get informed by information that I otherwise would not have access to. To your point, Zubin, on a busy day-to-day basis. I'd love having access to even if somebody sends me just like latest research in this particular area on, for example, digital health and the impact it's having somewhere. Somebody did a clinical trial in Australia. I would love to know that. I will never actually know it. I will never have access to it in a proactive way. So that's as a starting point. Is there opportunities then to build off of that and say, hey, I've always wanted to study digital health. Is there an opportunity to engage and help us build some of these things? Absolutely. I think no one in my organization would naturally say, hey, let's go to an academic and study this. We'll probably stumble ourselves in figuring out how to do it. So is there an opportunity to start to form those linkages and build off of those? I think that'd be tremendous. I will say, I think the challenge always exists maybe in terms of, this has always been obviously disconnect between academia and the business world is the speed, expediency, and rigor, right? You will not accept the level of rigor that we would accept in terms of doing some of these clinical trials, or not clinical trials, any kind of research for that matter. But we almost have to lower the bar to move at the speed at which the business moves in order to meet its objectives.
Yeah, a very important discussion. Thank you so much, Ned. And just a little advanced notice. I'm sure you've all enjoyed listening to Ned today as much as I have, and Ned will be joining us at the Center for Practice Excellence Speaker Series next Thursday, October the 4th, to discuss Green Shield's role in the essential medicines, generation of essential medicines programs. So please join us next Thursday at the CPE Speaker Seminar Series. Angeline, let me turn it over to you. So what's your piece of advice for how people on this call can engage with you to develop the kinds of strong, sustainable, and productive relationships that both of us need to see research find its place in decision-making?
Yeah, I think very similar to Ned, we value so much the evidence and findings that come out of the research community to inform and support the work that we do. We are very open to collaborating with the research community. I don't know, it may be not as widely known, but we do often write letters of support for applications for research projects. We help with like sharing links and promoting research and help with recruitment. Where some of that research is aligned with the pharmacy practice and some of our priorities, and then we sometimes are even more involved in that in research efforts, from being on an advisory group to even collaborating on like a demonstration project where we can bring some of that expertise around like, what do these pharmacy practices look like? There's so much diversity even within the community pharmacy sector. If you work under this banner or that banner or this franchise, like the workflow can be a little bit different, and that expertise that we bring to some of those research projects, I think, has been really successful. So yeah, always happy to support the research community how we can, and collaborate however possible.
Thank you. And last but not least, Shenda, what's your takeaway, your piece of advice for this crowd in terms of how we can work more productively, collaboratively, and sustainably with you in sort of having our research find value as actionable work?
Talk to Katya. That's my advice. So some of you are already, Katya through Open, and you can see how we are capitalizing on her ability to focus on this for the next year or so, to really establish a firm platform. After that, we may redistribute the discussions about research. But for the time being, I am here to tell you with love in my heart that she's a great big policy geek and would love nothing more than to talk about what might the research be, or how could it be helpful, or how could it be focused. So And she's happy to work 23 hours a day. The other hour she has to walk her dog. So just reach out to Katja. That's my actual concrete advice.
Perfect. And I see all three of you have spoken about that issue of relationships, talking to people, getting engaged as a researcher with knowledge users. I'd also invite all of you who are on the call, who are considering ways of having your research be maybe more actionable, to consider attending the Ontario Pharmacy Evidence Network annual symposium to be held. Oh, lots of good emphatic nods from our panelists as well. Many of our panelists will be there. It's a great opportunity not only to interact with knowledge users, but also fellow researchers. So I'm just going to ask Annalise to put up the link in the chat in case you have not had a chance to register for the conference. It's on October 11th at the Faculty Club at the University of Toronto. A great opportunity to connect with, meet and network and start the conversations that build the relationships that will allow for that kind of sustainable, actionable research to be able to move forward. Thank you so much, panelists. This has been a really interesting opportunity to hear your perspectives and to reflect on how sometimes our perspectives as researchers don't necessarily fully mesh with your needs. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm done asking you questions, though, and in the remaining 10 or 15 minutes we have with our audience, I would invite all of you in the audience to reflect on what you've heard, and you have an unparalleled opportunity right now to interact with 4 major policymakers and movers and shakers in the pharmacy world. I'd invite you to unmute and ask any questions you might have of them as a way of better understanding how your work might fit with their needs. Please feel free to put up your hand or simply unmute and turn your camera on and ask any questions that you would like. And please don't be shy. Lisa, go ahead. Lisa Dolovich.
Thanks, Zubin. I've been just, first of all, thank you everyone for your really amazing comments, and the conversation among you has also been really interesting as well. So just really, really great to be able to sort of take in what you're saying, even though I've talked to all of you many times before, that's for sure. One of the things that struck me about the comments overall is the real focus on patient outcomes and experience. Like it's coming, you know, really throughout all of what everyone has said. It's not so much on the professional, which is great. It's really about patients and sort of society and outcomes and experience. So prems and proms, which in some ways seems old school, but you know now, but is really still, I think, in the health system in Ontario, such a difficult thing to get at because of how our systems are organized. So I guess I'm making more of a comment than a question, but I guess I would also ask probably Ned and Katja mostly to comment on the fact that I would see that research on present, like outcomes for patients and experience for patients on a larger scale is needed. So not small scale. So the problem is we can only do small scale right now. We can only do little bits with certain populations and certain very specialized approaches, small scale kind of stuff. But what we really need to get to is much larger scale work, so that we can much better see where the care gaps are and where the experience, is low, and really address those in a meaningful way in our health system. So I see that as an important research topic. And so I guess my first question is, it feels like you concur, but I'm just wanting validation that you concur. And then, how do we all work together across a public-private system to just be better able to get at that information for the benefit of the public good. So Ned, you know, you're building a little health system there, but that's great. It's just for a small group of people. You know, Katya, we may be able through the college to do certain things for small groups of people in some way. But overall, I don't think that's good enough. So what say you, I guess?
I see Katya's hand has raised, so I'll give Ned a chance to think a little bit before putting him on the spot. Katya, your response or comment?
Okay. My hand was actually raised for another reason, but it's related to this, so that's fine. Lisa, I think that what I will 100% validate what you just said, and I think there is a huge interest in patient experience and what was the other term that you used? And patient like related outcome measures. I think that one of the conversations that we're having internally has to do, you know, Shenda's talked about risk and pharmacy practice-based risk and how the college is involved and needs to be more involved with reducing harm to patients. Well, the next question then becomes, well, what is harm? What kinds of harm are we looking at? Do we only mean, you know, death and significant injury, emergency room visits because of a medication error, or are there other areas that are also important to us in terms of patient harm? I would argue that a broader view is the one that we should be looking at, and the working group that we've created would like to have many different types of harm be included in a level playing field as we move forward. So that would include emotional harm or embarrassment. For example, if you have a trans patient come into a pharmacy and be maltreated or given the inappropriate medication for who they are as a person, we might include research on privacy breaches, especially as minor ailments become broader, and not all pharmacies have the ability to for the pharmacist or pharmacy professional to speak with a patient in a quiet, confidential, private space. So that is our wish, I think. And so doing this on a broad scale, I think would be the ultimate goal. Two constraints that I can see. One is that, you know, Zubin has talked about how quiet and calm the life of the college is. You know, so too is the life of practicing pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. And so in a world with competing priorities and a lot of craziness going on, will a focus on physical harm and extensive physical harm win? And so it's possible. And if that's the case, and we need to prioritize physical harm, then that's a slightly different approach to measuring outcomes than really looking at patient experience. And then what was my other one? Again, it's just a question of limited resources and whether or not, as a regulator, we're going to be able to begin to initiate research on a wide scale basis across every single pharmacy compared to other high priority areas of activity. Those are cautions, they're not no's. I think that the interest is there, the ability to work together to begin to try to get external funding to look at patient outcomes, especially as it relates to EDI. This might be a really ideal time to look at that, but other non-physical harm related outcomes as well. I think there'd be a huge interest in it.
Thank you. Ned, you were implicated in the last question, so I'll turn it over to you, but also invite Angeline if you have some thoughts in this area to go after Ned. Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, so I do think there's a little bit of a disconnect, even Lisa, between your comment and I think Hutchin and maybe in the college's focus, because like when you talk about harm, to me, that's like the lowest possible bar. Like it's like, are we hurting patients? It's such a floor to me. And of course, the college's objective is to say like patient protection and patient safety is paramount. But I think, Lisa, what you're referring to, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of like how do we elevate that patient experience and patient health outcomes way beyond the floor, right? So it's sort of like we're, you know, the bare minimum is this, but we want to get outcomes to this. We can do so much more, right? So that I do think as a healthcare system, we need to be more ambitious maybe towards those goals and to some degree use our regulatory teeth to move that needle. But that's always been, I feel like, the Achilles heel of our healthcare system. We're just never want to mandate anything. We're also nice. We got to get to a place where we're kind of a little bit sharper with some of these things and expect more, right? in the climate where it won't happen organically, right? So I do think that, you know, what is happening in our healthcare system and what's increasingly happening, and the examples I'm citing even of, you know, organizations like private insurers stepping into the spaces, there is more of that. Greater segments of the healthcare system are going in the direction of being involved private delivery. So with that, is that going to introduce a lot more competition, I think, to an otherwise maybe stale healthcare system, quite frankly, overall. I genuinely think it will. So I'll put those kind of maybe more controversial comments out there because I do think it's important to discuss it.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes remaining today, so I'm just going to turn over to Angie to comment on this before we wind things up. Angeline.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment about, you know, the fact that, you know, public opinion polling and research that's less academic research, I think does a good job in some ways of tackling that patient experience components, because there has been, and you know, we just had a meeting with some of our corporate partners and sponsors earlier this week, and there was a lot of interest in that patient experience and, you know, public polling data. And we know the government does a lot of this, and I don't think they really share all of it, but and they're informed by a lot of that public opinion polling that has to do with patient experience, patient opinion on access, quality of care, etc. And it sort of is interesting that, you know, there are all these efforts done sort of from like a surveying and public polling type perspective, but that doesn't seem to be the same in academic research. So I thought Lisa's question was really interesting because there are actually a lot of questions about, you know, what is the public opinion on this and what are the patient experiences, but we rely so heavily on just these surveys that get put out by research firms and et cetera that don't have the same rigor as some of the academic research does. So just thought I'd offer that thought.
Thank you so much. We've come to the conclusion of today's event. So first, let me thank our 4 panelists today, Ned, Shenda, Angeline, and Katya. Thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing your insights and some of your ideas for the many issues that we've talked about. Would also, of course, like to thank Annalise, who has been organizing this event, monitoring the chat, getting us all organized. Events like this cannot happen without Annalise Mathers, who is the Center Administrator for the Center for Practice Excellence, and is also organizing the Ontario Pharmacy Evidence Network session on October 11th. And we'll all see you there, won't we? And I'd also like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend, to listen, and to learn from this. And I hope that you'll find it very helpful as you go forward, not simply with a potential application to the new initiatives program, but also in your own research. Also, a quick reminder, of course, that tomorrow, September 30th, is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And in whatever way you see fit and appropriate, I hope all of us will have an opportunity to remember, to learn, and to think about ways that we can all as individuals advance the cause of truth and reconciliation in our own way. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.